Okay, here we are again with another Between the Pages book chat. This time we have fancy author Allan Batchelder, who's here to talk about his grimdark series, Immortal Treachery. So I'm going to let him introduce himself. Take it away.
Yes, hi, I'm Allan, and my series is a 5-book series, about 750,000 words, about an epic warrior. I grew up as a little boy reading my dad's Conan the Barbarian cast-offs, and so really that was my first, even before I read The Hobbit, that was my first introduction kind of to the genre. And so this is a Conan inspired warrior, the greatest warrior in his world, but his memories are rather dubious, and so there's some question about who he is and whether or not he's being manipulated by even greater forces. And so the first book is standalone, but if you want to continue, there's a 5-book arc that wraps everything up by the end of book 5. And it's got a lot of grimdark elements, but there's a lot of humor in it as well. My background is as a professional actor, and I was a stand-up comedian for 9.5 years or so. And so it just finds its way into the dialogue and the circumstances.
Yeah, I would think that grimdark could use a little humor to break up the dark as well.
Well, even Shakespeare does that. Right after Macbeth and Lady Macbeth hack King Duncan to pieces, out comes this drunken porter and tells a series of dick jokes. Pardon my French. To sort of lighten the mood, and you can't just hit people over the head with a hammer endlessly and expect them to hang with you. So
okay, so why don't you tell us a little bit about the main character? What is his best trait? What's his worst trait? Stuff like that.
So Tarman Vikers is his name, and he is the ultimate warrior. He's very arrogant as a result of never having lost, really. There are legends about him throughout the world and across the world, and he's known by a variety of different names. And he's abrasive. He doesn't have to apologize or accommodate anyone. But when we very first meet him, he's at his absolute lowest, impossibly low. And again, that's kind of inspired by my experience reading those Conan books. I didn't know there was an order when I read them as a kid. I just read them and learned about him as I went along. Kind of the same way, it was kind of the same way with comic books. When you say, "Ooh, that Iron Man character looks intriguing," you don't necessarily run out and find the oldest Iron Man comic book to give you the origin story. So the origin story for Tarman Vikers is late in coming and slow in developing, and you learn more every book, and there are lots of twists and turns and surprises ultimately. But he's somebody who's struggling to be in control of his own destiny. He's used to having everything his way, and he comes to discover that he's not in charge. He doesn't hold all the cards, and that's difficult. That's difficult for somebody of his stature to take.
Yeah. So you mentioned Conan. Did that influence the world you created, or because when I looked at the series, it looked kind of like it had a little Norse influence as well. So what were your influences there?
Yeah, there's a wide range of influences. influenced by Beowulf and Odysseus, and you mentioned Greek and Norse mythology before we got on the air, and those are very much influencers for me as well. And I drew from all kinds of mythos, the Clint Eastwood's Man with No Name in those spaghetti westerns, just someone who's faster and smarter and ahead of everyone else all the time. And Yojimbo, some of the Kurosawa films, with the Toshiro Mifune character, someone who's supreme at what he does, and it's fun to put him in circumstances where he does get challenged, where he is at a loss as for what to do. But so there's a wide range from mythology, certainly, and from contemporary culture. Some of the things that I just mentioned to you, there wasn't a single influencer, and I would say even influenced by my lifetime of gaming, like things like Dungeons and Dragons or computer games or video games, just wanting to tell my own story and deal with my protagonist in my own way. I wouldn't call him a hero. He's almost more of an anti-hero. He's a bad guy. But not because he strives to do evil. He just doesn't have the impulse to be beneficent or benevolent.
So what would you consider his worst trait?
Well, he has a complete lack of empathy, which can make him unlikable, but I think that's where some of the humor comes in. And he's forced into some really, really awkward circumstances at one point, and for a long time he has to share his body with a ghost of the opposite gender.
Oh, that should be interesting.
Yeah. And so that's incredibly humiliating and humbling for somebody who perceives himself to be almost godlike in his ability. So he's not supposed to be likable in the same way that Richard III in Shakespeare isn't likable necessarily. But it's a tragedy because Richard III, anyway, because he has heroic qualities, as does Macbeth, as does Othello. So it's more hopefully that you identify with those qualities than you like him per se.
Okay, so I know your first book has this big antagonist villain character. So can you talk a little bit about him?
What can I say without giving too much away? He is an old soul, an ancient soul who steals people's bodies. And he finds one at the beginning of book 1 that allows him to wreak havoc. He's really all about chaos and anarchy and wanting to burn down the world. Not because he wants to dominate it and have some sort of evil empire. He literally wants to destroy the world out of malice and for a variety of other reasons. And Vikers gets sort of drafted into opposing him and becoming the opposing force, kind of against his will, although he's an egomaniac. So the idea of taking on this horrible villain does have some appeal to Vikers. It's not fun being a professional football player if you only ever get to play junior high school teams. He wants to fight the best. He wants to take on the best and dominate and destroy the best. So that character gives himself a nickname, the end of all things. And it's a motif that goes throughout the series. But he's by no means the only bad guy. And he may not even be the principal bad guy. There are lots of politics. As you can imagine, in such a huge series, there are lots of politics. There's also lots of, swordplay and bloodshed and war and magic. I would say it's got a bit more magic than Game of Thrones, just because it's something that appeals to me. But it's got a lot of the same sort of Shakespearean influence. It's my understanding that George R.R. Martin wrote that series based on the War of the Roses, which is told in a bunch of Shakespeare plays. So there's definitely a Shakespearean influence to my books. You don't have to be a Shakespeare fan to get it, but I've been a Shakespearean actor for many, many years, and it's just something that really appealed to me.
Okay, so as the series is grimdark, I'm assuming a few people die in the books.
Oh, yes.
So, how do you stand on killing your characters? Do you enjoy killing them off, or are you hesitant about it?
I don't enjoy it. I'm not a sadist, but I recognize that bad things happen to good people, and good things happen to bad people, and good people do die in reality. And so lots and lots of people die throughout the series. In fact, I can't give it away. Lots of people, more than you can count.
Yeah, well, you're talking to a horror writer here who's killed off way too many characters. So yeah. Okay,
well, I'm talking in the millions.
Oh well, I have not got that many yet. I have gone into the thousands, but I have not reached the millions yet. Something to strive for, I guess.
Yes.
Okay, so what was the hardest scene for you to write?
The hardest thing was the fifth and final book as a whole, and it started. I was working on it during the final season of Game of Thrones, and hearing all the critical upset, people were really unhappy with the final season. And I was thinking about the final book of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, which is this massive 10-book series, and how the 10th book didn't was not as successful for me as the other 9. And that's my favorite series, by the way. So I don't mean any disrespect at all. Erickson's a genius, but writing the end of something is really hard. Emotionally, it's hard. Wanting to make your readers happy, wanting to give them some sort of fulfillment about characters' fates and destinies, but also wanting to kind of tell their truth. Like, your favorite character doesn't necessarily get to live just because you love that character. And that's hard. And I would also say, in many ways, in the last few years, the political and sort of social climate of the world has intruded on my life, where it's made it a little more difficult to be as creative as I would like to be. I come home and the news goes on, and I can waste 4 hours watching the news. And at the end of it, what have I got?
Yeah, I stopped watching the news.
We try that. We're like addicts. Every once in a while, we don't watch it for a while, and then what's going on, and then we switch it back on. And I don't mean the royal we. I mean my wife and me.
Okay, so what's your favorite scene in the series?
My favorite scene, gosh, there's Well, there's a reunion, a family reunion, if you will, that the characters go through such agony and despair, and when they're finally able to reunite, it's almost like a holy event. You know, it's sacred in some way, and I think that was my favorite and most fulfilling for me.
Okay, so do you have any quirky characters in the series or Steam
I do, I do. I have a character. Well, one of the major characters is a guy called Long Pete, and when we first meet him, he's an out of work gigolo, and he's he's really meant to be sort of the everyman character. He's tried every career and failed at everything, and he has I think, a fascinating and unpredictable story arc. Where he ends up at the end of the series is never where you would have predicted. There's also a character who's called kind of the village idiot. His name is Spurk, and he's literally so gullible and so boring that he's invisible. It's like an inherent power he has. He could be standing right in front of you, and he's so incredibly boring that you can't even see him if you're looking at him. So he actually uses that ability as a superpower inadvertently throughout the series. And he changes too. I mean, I think you have to have that in a good, lengthy series where all the characters are different people at the end than they were at the beginning. Otherwise, it's static. And so, anyway, with those two characters I mentioned and a number of others, there's a lot of room for comedy. I've got like the world's champion drunkard in the series. He's part of that same gang of people. If you could picture the most bumbling and inept gang of D&D characters, Dungeons and Dragons characters, I mean, these guys are like first level, and they stay for first level, and they make all their own choices, and somehow they're like Forrest Gump. They manage to be right there in the eye of history, despite their ineptitude and their goofiness. So there's plenty of comic relief, and I think it's gotten great reviews, and the critics have enjoyed it. So it must be doing something right.
Yeah. Okay, so are there any characters that you've written that you'd like to hang out with in real life?
I actually would like to hang out with the village idiot character, just because he's really sweet in his core, and he's fun to tease and get laughs. We get laughs at his expense, but he's really a sweet person. Ultimately, I think there are some really powerful, strong female characters. One of the main characters is called Aoife, and she's I guess you would call her a cleric or a priestess or something, and she's just a really level-headed, intelligent, doesn't need anyone, welcomes friendships and things, but she's not dependent upon anyone. And she has a unique story and a desire for some revenge or justice. There's an old queen who's kind of based on Queen Elizabeth I. And she would be fun to hang out with because she's just so incredibly smart. She's as sharp as a tack, But I think there's somebody in there for everybody. In the theater, I've had a chance to really observe so many characters over my life, and identify character types. And I think there's really something there for everyone, as they said.
Oh, sounds great. Okay, so is there any genre that you'd like to write in that you haven't tried yet?
Well, I do have a horror novel planned. I probably read or have been reading more horror than fantasy over the last few years, horror novels. I have a steampunk that I'm planned on working with my son on. He's an artist, and so he would do illustrations maybe for it. And then I have a YA fantasy, young adult fantasy that I'm thinking of, and then I'll probably come back to fantasy. But everything appeals to me. I would love to write some sort of humorous social commentary on the times we're living in if I had the tools, the skills.
Okay, so do you want to give us a sneak peek at any upcoming projects?
Well, the one I alluded to before we're on the air is, I guess we decided, historical fantasy. It's there's a whole movement out there, a series of people who believe that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare, that he was written by someone else, like Christopher Marlowe, who would allegedly have faked his own death and then gone to France. And so,
and Francis Bacon, I believe, is a candidate for that as well.
Yes. So there's hundreds, but I have Shakespeare faking his own death and coming to the New World, to Jamestown, where, this is going to sound really strange, but he runs into Grendel from Beowulf. It's the same species. It's not the actual monster, but it's a creature of the same species. But the Native Americans know it as Wendigo.
Oh.
So it's almost a Sherlock Holmes, Hound of the Baskervilles type of story, in which Shakespeare is going to have to square off with this monster, this supernatural entity, whatever it might be, while trying to survive as a member of frontier Jamestown, frontier colonies, at a time when there were only 1,000 people in all of Virginia, 1,000 settlers, I should say. And how does he interact with the natives? And, the advent of slavery in 1619. So he's going to find out that he has an illegitimate son. I'm working on it.
Sounds like it's going to be very interesting.
Yeah, well, I told somebody the idea and they laughed in my face and said, "You'll never be able to pull it off." So that just really motivated me.
Yeah, so we have a comment. She likes the sound of it too. So.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to wrap it up here. So I'll let you tell everybody where they can find you and your books.
Well, my books are all over online. I suppose the most common place is Amazon. And the first book is called Steel, Blood, and Fire. I also have a website, Immortal Treachery, one word, immortaltreachery.com. But if you look hard enough, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Pinterest, just trying to get the word out and build my reader base. And I love interacting with readers. So any kind of questions people want to send me, I think you have my email address, but it's also on my website. That would be fantastic.
Okay, so thanks for being here. It was a pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you. I loved it.
Yeah, and Between the Pages, we'll be back on the weekend with Jeff Kohanek and Eileen Mueller. And so we'll see you then. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity.